The morning sun cast long shadows across the busy Atlanta airport terminal as James Carter made his way toward Gate C-23. He adjusted the strap of his leather messenger bag on his shoulder and checked his watch. Still 30 minutes before boarding would begin for his flight to Chicago. James found an empty seat near the gate and settled in, pulling out a dog-eared book on criminal psychology that he'd been trying to finish for weeks. Between his heavy caseload and family responsibilities, finding time to read had become a luxury. Today's 2-hour flight would give him the perfect opportunity to make progress before he had to switch his mind to instructor mode for tomorrow's training seminar. As he flipped through the pages to find his bookmark, James noticed a young boy watching him curiously from across the waiting area. The child, maybe 6 or 7 years old, whispered something to his mother while pointing in James's direction. James offered a friendly smile and returned to his book, used to the occasional stares his imposing 6'2" frame sometimes attracted. Now boarding Flight 1482 to Chicago, starting with our first-class passengers and those needing special assistance, announced a voice over the intercom. James tucked his book into his bag and joined the boarding line, ticket in hand. He hadn't originally planned to fly first class, but the bureau had booked his ticket last minute when the training seminar was moved up a week. He wasn't going to complain about the extra legroom, especially since his knees typically pressed against the seat in front of him in economy. "Good morning, sir. Enjoy your flight," said the gate agent, a middle-aged man with a neat beard and tired eyes, as he scanned James's boarding pass. Walking down the jetway, James mentally reviewed his presentation for tomorrow. The training session focused on community engagement techniques for new FBI recruits, particularly important given recent tensions between law enforcement and minority communities. After 15 years with the Bureau, James had seen both progress and setbacks in this area. Stepping onto the plane, he nodded politely to the flight attendant who greeted passengers at the door. The narrow aisle of the aircraft was already becoming congested as people struggled with oversized carry-ons and searched for their seat numbers. 5A, 5A, James muttered to himself, scanning the row numbers. Finding his window seat near the front of the first-class cabin, he quickly stored his messenger bag in the overhead compartment. The smell of coffee and cleaning products hung in the air, that distinct airplane smell that somehow felt the same on every flight. James settled into his seat, appreciating the extra width and cushioning that economy seats definitely lacked. He pulled out his phone to send a quick text to his wife Tanya. "Boarding now. Will call when I land in Chicago. Love you." 3 dots appeared immediately, followed by her reply. "Safe travels. Don't forget to ask hotel about early check-in. Love you too." James smiled. Tanya always thought of the practical details he might overlook. After 12 years of marriage, they had developed a comfortable rhythm, each complementing the other's strengths and weaknesses. As the first-class cabin slowly filled, James pulled out his book again. The chapter he'd been reading discussed unconscious bias in witness testimony, ironically relevant to his upcoming training session. He became so absorbed in the material that he barely noticed the continued boarding process around him. The middle seat next to him remained empty as the minutes ticked by. James hoped it might stay that way, giving him some extra elbow room for the journey. But as the final boarding call was announced, he glanced up to see the last few passengers making their way down the aisle. An older businessman took the aisle seat in James's row, briefly nodding before immediately donning headphones and opening his laptop. Perfect seatmate, James thought, someone who clearly valued their personal space as much as he valued his. The flight attendants began their final checks as the cabin doors were closed. Outside the window, baggage handlers loaded the last of the luggage into the plane's belly. James watched them work with practiced efficiency, tossing bags that probably contained fragile items marked "Handle with care." He put his book away as the safety demonstration began, though he barely paid attention after hundreds of flights just like this one. Instead, his mind wandered to the week ahead. The faces of the new recruits he would meet, the dinner plans with his old academy buddy now stationed in Chicago, the case files he needed to review upon his return. Little did James know that this routine flight was about to become anything but ordinary. The plane was about to push back from the gate when the flight attendant's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're waiting for just a few more passengers who are connecting from a delayed flight. We should be on our way in about 10 minutes. Thank you for your patience." James glanced at his watch and sighed. Delays were part of traveling, but he still hoped to reach Chicago with enough time to prepare for tomorrow. He returned to his book, trying to focus on the words despite the growing chatter around him. 5 minutes later, a small commotion at the front of the plane caught his attention. A group of rushed-looking passengers hurried aboard, apologizing as they squeezed past others already settled in their seats. Among them was a woman in her mid-50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and designer sunglasses perched on top of her head. She wore an expensive-looking beige pantsuit and carried a leather handbag that probably cost more than James's monthly car payment. The woman paused in the aisle, checking her boarding pass and then looking at the row numbers. Her eyes landed on the empty middle seat next to James, and her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. She double-checked her boarding pass, as if hoping she had misread it. "Excuse me," she said to the flight attendant who was helping another passenger stow a bag. "There must be some mistake. I always book an aisle seat." The flight attendant, a friendly-looking woman with curly hair pulled back in a neat bun, smiled apologetically. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the flight is completely full. That middle seat is your assigned seat." The woman, whose designer name tag on her bag read Patricia Winters, pursed her lips and looked again at James, who had politely returned to his book to avoid making her uncomfortable with his gaze. "Is there any way I could be moved?" Patricia asked, lowering her voice slightly but not enough that James couldn't hear. "Perhaps somewhere more suitable." The flight attendant checked her tablet. "I'm sorry, but as I mentioned, we're completely full today. That's your assigned seat." With obvious reluctance, Patricia placed her designer bag in the overhead compartment and perched on the edge of the middle seat, keeping as much distance between herself and James as the confined space would allow. The stiffness in her posture made it clear she was unhappy with the arrangement. James offered a polite nod and smile, which she didn't return. Instead, she pulled out her phone and began scrolling through it, her body angled away from him as much as possible. The plane finally pushed back from the gate, and the safety demonstration began. James put his book away and listened half-heartedly to the familiar instructions. Next to him, Patricia ignored the demonstration entirely, continuing to scroll through her phone despite the flight attendant's instructions to put electronic devices in airplane mode. "Ma'am," the flight attendant said, stopping by their row, "I'll need you to switch your phone to airplane mode now." Patricia looked up with obvious annoyance but complied, making a small huffing sound as she did so. Once the flight attendant moved on, she muttered something under her breath that James couldn't quite catch, though the tone was unmistakably bitter. As the plane taxied toward the runway, James tried to return to his book, but the tension radiating from the woman next to him made it difficult to concentrate. He closed his eyes instead, hoping a short nap might make the flight pass more quickly. The takeoff was smooth, and once they reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign dinged off. The flight attendants began preparing for beverage service. Patricia immediately pressed her call button. When the flight attendant arrived, Patricia spoke in a hushed but urgent tone. "I need to speak with you privately," she said, glancing sideways at James. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" the flight attendant asked. "No, everything is not all right," Patricia replied, her voice growing slightly louder. "I don't feel comfortable in this seat. Is there really nowhere else I can sit?" The flight attendant looked confused. "Is the seat uncomfortable? Is there a mechanical issue?" "No, it's not that," Patricia said, lowering her voice again and leaning closer to the flight attendant. "It's just, I don't feel safe." At this, James couldn't help but look up from his book. Safe? What could possibly be unsafe about sitting next to him? The flight attendant's eyes darted briefly toward James, then back to Patricia. "Ma'am, is there a specific concern you have?" Patricia's voice dropped to an even quieter whisper, but in the confined space, James could still make out her words. "That man, he keeps looking at me strangely, and he's been fidgeting with something in his pocket. I just don't feel comfortable." James felt a cold weight settle in his stomach as he realized what was happening. This wasn't about a seating preference. This was about him, more specifically, about the color of his skin. He'd experienced this before, of course. The sideways glances in upscale stores. The women who clutched their purses tied up when he entered an elevator. The security guards who followed him around shopping malls. But somehow, being trapped on a plane with someone who viewed him as a threat simply because of his appearance felt different, more claustrophobic, more inescapable. The flight attendant looked uncomfortable now, caught between protocol and an obviously baseless complaint. "Ma'am, I don't see any cause for concern, but could you please get your supervisor?" Patricia interrupted, her voice growing louder. "I don't think you're taking my concerns seriously." Several nearby passengers had begun to turn in their seats, curious about the growing disturbance. James felt their eyes on him, assessing, wondering. The peaceful flight he had hoped for was quickly evaporating, replaced by a familiar tension that he had faced far too many times before. The lead flight attendant made her way down the aisle toward them. Her name tag read Diane, and she had the confident walk of someone who had handled countless in-flight situations. "What seems to be the problem here?" she asked, her voice calm but authoritative. Before Patricia could answer, a passenger from across the aisle chimed in, "This lady is making a fuss about her seat assignment." Patricia shot the man an icy glare. "I'm not making a fuss. I have genuine concerns about my safety on this flight." Diane looked between Patricia and James, who was still sitting quietly, his book now closed on his lap. "Ma'am, could you step into the galley with me so we can discuss your concerns?" Patricia stood up, smoothing her expensive pantsuit. "Gladly." As she stepped past the businessman in the aisle seat, she muttered, "Someone needs to do something before it's too late." James felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He'd been here before, the subject of suspicion for simply existing in a space someone else deemed wasn't meant for people who looked like him. He took a deep breath and tried to stay calm, aware that any display of frustration would only reinforce Patricia's misguided fears. The businessman in the aisle seat gave James an apologetic look. "Don't let it get to you, man," he said quietly. "Some people are just stuck in the 1950s. James nodded appreciatively but didn't respond. He'd learned long ago that reacting emotionally only made these situations worse. Instead, he pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to his wife. "Interesting flight so far. Tell you about it later." Putting his feelings into words would have to wait. About 5 minutes passed before Patricia returned with Diane and another flight attendant behind her. The look on Patricia's face was one of indignation mixed with smug satisfaction. She stood in the aisle, pointing directly at James. "That man," she said loudly enough for several rows to hear, "has been watching me since I sat down. He keeps reaching into his pocket, and I think he might have something dangerous. I absolutely refuse to sit next to him." Several passengers turned to look. Some appeared embarrassed by Patricia's outburst, others curious, and a few seemed concerned, not about James, but about the disruption to their flight. Diane maintained her professional demeanor. "Sir, I apologize for the disturbance. Would you mind if I asked what you have in your pocket?" James felt a wave of humiliation wash over him. He was being treated like a criminal for absolutely no reason. "My pocket?" he asked, keeping his voice level despite the anger building inside him. "Yes, this lady says you've been reaching into your pocket repeatedly, and it's making her uncomfortable." James almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "I have a pack of gum," he said, slowly reaching into his pocket and pulling out a half-empty pack of spearmint gum. "Would anyone like a piece?" A few passengers chuckled nervously. Patricia's face flushed red, but she didn't back down. "That's not all he has," she insisted. "He was acting suspicious before you came over. And anyway, I shouldn't have to explain why I feel uncomfortable. I'm a frequent flyer with platinum status, and I demand to be moved to another seat." An older woman across the aisle spoke up. "The only person causing a disturbance on this flight is you, ma'am." Patricia whirled around. "Excuse me? You don't understand the situation." "I understand perfectly," the woman replied calmly. "I've been watching this whole scene unfold, and that gentleman hasn't done anything except read his book and mind his own business." A murmur of agreement rose from several nearby passengers. Patricia looked around, apparently surprised that she wasn't getting the support she expected. Diane stepped in before the situation could escalate further. "Ma'am, we take all passenger concerns seriously, but I haven't observed any behavior that would warrant moving anyone. If you're uncomfortable in your assigned seat, we can try to find you another one, but as I mentioned before, this is a full flight." "This is unacceptable," Patricia said, her voice rising. I want to speak to the captain. Now. The captain is currently flying the plane, ma'am, Diane replied, a hint of firmness entering her voice. But I'd be happy to relay your concerns after we reach cruising altitude. Fine, Patricia snapped. But I will not sit next to this man. He doesn't even look like he belongs in first class. A shocked silence fell over the nearby rows as the true nature of Patricia's concerns became crystal clear to everyone within earshot. James felt dozens of eyes on him, some sympathetic, others just curious about how he would react. He could have gotten angry. He could have called her out for her obvious racism. He could have made a scene that would have probably ended with him being the one removed from the flight, despite being the victim. Instead, he looked directly at Patricia for the first time and spoke in a calm, measured voice. Ma'am, I understand you're uncomfortable, but I paid for this seat just like you paid for yours. I have the same right to be here as anyone else on this plane. Patricia's eyes widened at being directly addressed. I never said you didn't have a right to be here, she sputtered. I just don't feel safe, and no one seems to care about that. What exactly are you afraid I'm going to do? James asked, still keeping his voice level. Patricia looked flustered. I don't know. That's the point. You could be anyone. Yes, I could, James agreed. Just like you could be anyone. Just like every person on this plane could be anyone. But only one of us is being treated like a threat based on how we look. The businessman in the aisle seat nodded approvingly. A few passengers even applauded quietly. Patricia looked around, suddenly realizing she had lost whatever support she might have hoped to gather. Diane stepped in again. Sir, I apologize for this disruption. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to take your seat now, so we can continue our service, or I can see if there's a middle seat available elsewhere in the aircraft if you prefer. The indignity of being offered a middle seat elsewhere versus the first-class seat she paid for seemed to finally register with Patricia. She looked torn between her fear and her entitlement to the premium seat. Patricia stood in the aisle, her face a mix of frustration and embarrassment. Finally, she sat down with a huff, keeping her body angled as far away from James as possible. This isn't over, she muttered, just loud enough for James to hear. Diane gave James an apologetic smile before continuing down the aisle with the beverage cart. The other passengers gradually turned their attention back to their own business, though a few kept glancing over, curious about what might happen next. James took a deep breath and tried to focus on his book again, but the words swam before his eyes. His heart was still beating too fast from the confrontation. Despite his calm exterior, these situations always left him feeling drained and slightly sick to his stomach. He'd been dealing with this kind of treatment his entire life, but it never got easier. The flight attendants began serving drinks. When they reached James's row, Diane asked, "What can I get for you, sir?" "Just water, please," James replied. Patricia interrupted before Diane could even turn to her. "I need to speak with the captain immediately. This situation is completely unacceptable." Diane's professional smile tightened slightly. "As I mentioned earlier, the captain is flying the aircraft. I'll be happy to pass along any concerns after we complete the beverage service." "This can't wait," Patricia insisted, her voice rising again. "That man is making threatening movements. Look at him." James had simply shifted in his seat to accept his water from Diane. Several nearby passengers exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from annoyance to disbelief at Patricia's continued disruption. A middle-aged man 2 rows ahead turned around. "Lady, give it a rest. The only person bothering anyone on this flight is you." Patricia's face flushed red. "You don't understand. I've seen the news. I know what can happen on these flights." The businessman in the aisle seat of James's row sighed loudly. "What exactly do you think is happening here? This gentleman has been nothing but polite while you've been causing a scene for 20 minutes. "I'm not causing a scene," Patricia nearly shouted, causing even more heads to turn. "I'm concerned for everyone's safety." James closed his eyes briefly, wishing he could disappear. Being the center of attention like this was excruciating, especially when the attention stemmed from someone else's prejudice. He considered offering to move seats himself just to end the situation, but a lifetime of experience had taught him that giving in to this kind of behavior only reinforced it. Diane leaned closer to Patricia. "Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice. You're disturbing the other passengers." "I will not be silenced." Patricia declared, standing up abruptly. If the captain won't come speak with me, then I want to speak with someone from airline security. This man keeps looking at me. Ma'am, we're 30,000 feet in the air, Diane explained patiently. There is no airline security on board. Now please, take your seat and lower your voice. Several passengers had their phones out now, recording the incident. Patricia noticed and pointed accusingly. Are you filming me? That's a violation of my privacy. I demand that you stop filming me right now. A young woman who was recording spoke up. Actually, there's no expectation of privacy in a public space like an airplane cabin, and I think it's important to document what's happening here. The second flight attendant, a tall man with a kind face, had made his way to their row. What's going on, Diane? He asked quietly. Before Diane could answer, Patricia jumped in. This man is threatening me, and no one will do anything about it. I want him removed from this flight immediately. The male flight attendant looked confused. Ma'am, we can't remove anyone from the flight while we're in the air. Then turn the plane around. Patricia demanded. This is an emergency. James finally spoke up. The only emergency is that you seem determined to create one out of nothing. I've done absolutely nothing to you. See, he's talking to me now. Patricia said triumphantly, as if this proved her point. He's trying to intimidate me. The businessman in the aisle seat stood up. That's enough. I'm a retired police officer, and I've been sitting here watching this whole thing unfold. This gentleman has done nothing wrong. You're harassing him based on nothing but your own prejudice. Patricia gasped. How dare you? I'm not prejudiced. I just know danger when I see it. What danger? The retired officer asked, his voice steady but firm. Be specific. What has this man done that is dangerous? He. Patricia stammered, struggling to come up with anything concrete. He looks suspicious. The retired officer shook his head. That's not a legitimate reason, and you know it. Look around you. Everyone on this plane can see what's really happening here. Patricia looked around and indeed saw dozens of unsympathetic faces staring back at her. Some passengers were openly glaring, while others looked embarrassed on her behalf. A few were still recording the incident on their phones. You're all going to feel foolish when something happens, she said, her voice slightly less confident now. I'm just trying to protect myself. Diane stepped in again. Ma'am, I've observed nothing concerning about this gentleman's behavior. What I have observed is you repeatedly disrupting this flight. If you continue, I'll have no choice but to document this as an incident of passenger misconduct, which could result in consequences when we land. Patricia's eyes widened. Are you threatening me now? I'm the victim here. No one is threatening anyone, Diane replied calmly. I'm simply explaining airline policy. Now, can we all please return to our seats and enjoy the remainder of the flight? James took another sip of his water, desperately wishing the flight would end. He could feel a stress headache forming behind his eyes. The seminar he was supposed to lead tomorrow suddenly felt very far away. How was he supposed to talk to FBI recruits about community relations when this kind of thing was still happening to him personally? Patricia fell into a sullen silence, aggressively tapping at her phone screen as though documenting her own version of events. The tension in the row was palpable, like a rubber band stretched to its limit, ready to snap at any moment. The older woman from across the aisle caught James's eye and gave him a sympathetic smile. I'm sorry this is happening to you, she mouthed silently. James nodded gratefully. These small gestures of solidarity meant more than people realized. They were reminders that not everyone saw the world through Patricia's distorted lens. Just as things seemed to be calming down, Patricia pressed her call button again. When Diane returned, looking increasingly strained, Patricia pointed at James's jacket pocket. He's reaching for something again, she said accusingly. I saw him. He's got something in there. All eyes turned to James once again. He could feel the weight of their stares, some concerned, others annoyed at the continued disruption. The businessman in the aisle seat shook his head in disbelief at Patricia's persistence. Ma'am, Diane said, her voice showing the first real signs of impatience, we've already addressed this. The gentleman has shown you he was simply carrying gum in his pocket. Not that pocket, Patricia insisted. His inside jacket pocket. He just reached in there. I saw him. James had indeed reached into his inner jacket pocket, but only to check his phone after feeling it vibrate with what was probably a text message from his wife. He took a deep breath. This situation had gone far enough. "You're right," James said calmly, looking directly at Patricia. "I did reach into my jacket pocket." Patricia's eyes widened, and she leaned away from him as if expecting him to pull out a weapon. "See, he admits it. Check what he has in there." The tension in the cabin grew thick. Even passengers who had been ignoring the situation now turned to watch. A child a few rows back asked his mother in a stage whisper, "Is something bad going to happen?" James looked at Diane, then at the male flight attendant who had joined them. "With your permission," he said to them, "I'd like to show everyone what I have in my pocket, so we can finally put this to rest." Diane nodded. "Of course, sir." With slow, deliberate movements, aware that certain gestures might be misinterpreted by Patricia, James reached into his inner jacket pocket. Patricia pushed herself even further away, practically climbing into the lap of the businessman in the aisle seat, who looked thoroughly annoyed by the entire situation. "Be careful," Patricia warned the flight attendants. "You don't know what he might have." James pulled out a small leather wallet, slightly worn at the edges from years of use. He held it up for everyone to see. "This is what I was reaching for," he said. Patricia looked both relieved and disappointed. "Well, you were being sneaky about it." "I wasn't being sneaky," James replied. "I was checking my phone after it vibrated, and then I remembered I needed something from my wallet." He opened the wallet, and instead of pulling out a credit card or driver's license as everyone expected, he removed a gold badge with the letters FBI prominently displayed at the top. Next to it was his identification card with his photo, name, and title. "My name is Special Agent James Carter," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent cabin. "I work for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I'm traveling to Chicago to lead a training seminar for new recruits." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the constant hum of the airplane engines seemed to fade into the background as every passenger processed what they were seeing. Patricia's face drained of color. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The businessman in the aisle seat didn't bother hiding his satisfied smile. "An FBI agent," someone whispered a few rows back. "She's been harassing an FBI agent this whole time." Diane looked at the badge, then at James. "Thank you for your service, Agent Carter," she said. "I apologize for the disruption to your flight." "No apology necessary," James replied, tucking his badge back into his wallet. "You and your crew have handled this situation professionally." Patricia finally found her voice, though it was much smaller than before. How was I supposed to know who you were?" James turned to her with a calm expression. "You weren't. And that's the point. You made assumptions about me based solely on my appearance. You decided I was dangerous without any evidence. That's not caution, ma'am. That's prejudice." Several passengers nodded in agreement. One even clapped briefly before stopping, embarrassed by the attention. Patricia's face flushed red again, this time from shame rather than anger. "I didn't mean. I wasn't trying to." "I think," the retired police officer cut in, "what the lady is failing to say is I'm sorry." Patricia looked around at the unsympathetic faces surrounding her. The phones recording the incident seemed to multiply. Tomorrow, her face would likely be plastered across social media, another example of what people had started calling Karens in the wild. "This is just a misunderstanding," she tried weakly. "I was just being cautious." "Were you?" asked an older woman from across the aisle. "Or were you simply uncomfortable sitting next to a black man in first class?" Patricia's eyes welled with tears. Whether they were tears of genuine remorse or simply embarrassment was impossible to tell. "I want to be moved to another seat," she whispered to Diane. "Please." Diane looked at the male flight attendant, who nodded slightly. "Let me see what's available," she said. While Diane checked her tablet for open seats, the other passengers began talking among themselves, the excited buzz of conversation filling the cabin. A few people leaned into the aisle to get a better look at James and his badge, which he had placed back in his wallet. "I've never met an FBI agent before," said a young woman seated behind James. "Is it like in the movies?" James laughed gently. "Not quite as exciting most days. A lot more paperwork than they show on TV." Other passengers chimed in with questions that James answered politely but briefly. He didn't want to encourage too much attention. Despite his calm exterior, the confrontation had left him drained, and he still had a long day ahead of him in Chicago. Diane returned to their row. "Ma'am, there's one middle seat available in row 28. Would you like to move there?" Row 28 would be near the back of the plane, far from the spacious comfort of first class. Patricia hesitated, clearly torn between her desire to get away from James and her reluctance to give up the premium seat she paid for. Finally, practicality won out over pride. "Yes," she said quietly, "I'll move." As Patricia gathered her belongings, avoiding eye contact with everyone around her, the businessman in the aisle seat leaned toward James and said quietly, "That was the most satisfying thing I've seen in years." "Well handled, Agent." Patricia gathered her belongings with shaking hands, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her chest like a shield. She kept her eyes downcast as she stood up, aware of the dozens of stares following her every move. The walk of shame down the airplane aisle stretched before her like a gauntlet. Just before stepping away, she paused and turned slightly toward James. She began, but the words seemed to get stuck in her throat. "It's fine," James said quietly, though they both knew it wasn't. He wasn't interested in her forced apology or excuses. He'd heard them all before. As she made her way to the back of the plane, trailing behind Diane, phones continued to record her retreat. Someone a few rows back slow clapped, and a few others joined in. Patricia's shoulders hunched further with each mocking clap. The businessman in the aisle seat turned to James. "Robert Wilson," he said, extending his hand. "Retired Chicago PD. 27 years on the force." "James Carter," James replied, shaking the offered hand. 15 years with the Bureau." "I figured law enforcement," Robert said with a knowing nod. "You've got the patience. Most people would have lost their cool with that woman 5 minutes in." James smiled tiredly. "Part of the job description. De-escalation is always better than confrontation." "Tell me about it," Robert agreed. "Though I've got to say, the look on her face when you pulled out that badge, priceless." He chuckled. "Worth the price of the ticket just for that." The older woman from across the aisle leaned over. "I'm just sorry you had to go through that at all," she said to James. "My son's a black doctor in Boston. The stories he tells me." She shook her head sadly. "Some people see the uniform or the white coat, but they never see past the skin." James nodded in understanding. It was a reality he'd lived with his entire life. The badge sometimes changed how people treated him, but it never changed how they initially saw him. As the commotion died down, other passengers began stopping by James's row on their way to the bathroom or to stretch their legs. Some wanted to see his badge again. Others shared their own stories of witnessing discrimination. A few just wanted to express their support. "My daughter's in college studying criminal justice," one man told him proudly. "She wants to join the FBI someday." "Tell her to apply," James said. "We need good people who care about justice." A young black woman in her 20s paused by his row. "Thank you," she said simply, "for keeping your cool. For showing everyone, that we can be anything, even when they try to put us in boxes." James felt a lump form in his throat. "Just doing my job," he said, but they both knew it was more than that. Every time someone like him stayed professional in the face of prejudice, it chipped away at stereotypes and opened doors for others to follow. The male flight attendant returned with a fresh cup of coffee for James. "On the house," he said with a wink. "Figured you could use it after all that." "Thanks," James said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Has she calmed down back there?" The flight attendant nodded. "She's sitting quietly between a large gentleman who's snoring and a mother with a fussy baby. Poetic justice, if you ask me." Several passengers within earshot chuckled. The mood in the first-class cabin had lightened considerably now that Patricia was gone. It felt like everyone had collectively witnessed a small victory against the kind of everyday racism that usually went unchallenged. Robert checked his watch. "Another hour to Chicago. You said you're leading a training there?" James nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "For new recruits. Ironically, part of it is about community relations and recognizing implicit bias." "Well," Robert said with a wry smile, "you've got yourself a hell of a case study now, don't you?" James laughed, his first genuine laugh since boarding the plane. "I do at that." As the conversation continued, James found himself sharing more about his work than he normally would with strangers. There was something about having witnessed his vulnerability that made these people feel like more than just random passengers. They had seen him not just as an FBI agent, but as a man forced to defend his right to exist in a space. A message from the captain came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our initial descent into Chicago. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." James glanced out the window at the city coming into view below. Chicago's skyline stretched along Lake Michigan, the early afternoon sun glinting off glass and steel. Somewhere down there was the FBI field office where tomorrow he would stand in front of a room full of eager faces and try to impart wisdom about navigating a world that wasn't always fair or just. His phone vibrated with a text from Tanya. "Landed yet? Hotel confirmed early check-in." He smiled and texted back, "Starting descent now. Got quite a story to tell you later." Robert noticed his smile. "Wife?" James nodded. 15 years next month. She's heard all my stories about this kind of thing. Still gets angry every time." "Good," Robert said. "We should all stay angry about it. The day we accept it as normal is the day we lose." The plane banked gently, beginning its approach pattern. James tucked his phone away and returned his seat to the upright position. The incident with Patricia had shaken him more than he wanted to admit, bringing back memories of countless similar encounters throughout his life. But it had also reminded him why his work mattered, why representation mattered, why staying calm and professional in the face of prejudice mattered. Someone a few rows ahead was still watching the video they'd recorded of the confrontation. James could hear Patricia's voice distantly. "He doesn't even look like he belongs in first class." He shook his head slightly. If only she knew how many times he'd heard variations of those words. If only she knew that tomorrow, when he stood before those new recruits, he would use this very experience to help them understand the world a little better. The plane touched down on the Chicago runway with a gentle bump, the tires squealing briefly before the aircraft began to slow. James looked out the window at the familiar airport. He'd been here dozens of times for work, but this visit already felt different because of what had happened during the flight. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chicago O'Hare International Airport," the captain's voice announced over the intercom. "Local time is 2:17 p.m., and the temperature outside is 72 degrees. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the aircraft has come to a complete stop and the seatbelt sign has been turned off." As the plane taxied toward the gate, Robert turned to James. "You know, I've been thinking about what happened with that woman. In my years on the force, I saw that kind of thing too often. People's assumptions based on nothing but appearance." James nodded. "It's exhausting, always having to prove you belong in spaces where others are automatically accepted." "My partner on the force was black," Robert continued. "Best cop I ever worked with. The things he put up with," he shook his head, "made me understand I had it easy in ways I never even thought about before." The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers immediately began reaching for the overhead compartments, eager to disembark. James stayed seated, in no rush to join the crowd, pushing toward the exit. Experience had taught him that patience was usually rewarded with a smooth departure. As people stood in the aisles waiting to file out, a young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, peeked around his mother to stare at James. "Are you really an FBI agent?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. James smiled. "I really am." "Do you catch bad guys?" "Sometimes," James replied. "Mostly I help train other agents how to do their jobs better." The boy's mother, looking slightly embarrassed, gently nudged her son. "Charlie, don't bother the gentleman." "He's not bothering me," James assured her. He turned back to the boy. "Do you want to see my badge again?" The boy nodded eagerly, and James pulled out his credentials, holding them where Charlie could see clearly. The boy's face lit up with excitement. "Cool. I want to be an FBI agent when I grow up." "We could always use good people," James said, tucking his badge away again. "Study hard, stay out of trouble, and maybe someday you will be." As the line of departing passengers finally reached their row, James stood and retrieved his bag from the overhead compartment. Robert did the same, and they joined the slow procession toward the exit. When they reached the door where the flight crew was saying goodbye to passengers, Diane caught James's eye. "Agent Carter, on behalf of the entire crew, I want to apologize again for what happened today. No apology necessary, James assured her. You handled it professionally. The captain, standing next to Diane, extended his hand. Agent Carter, I was briefed about the situation. I'm sorry you had to experience that on our flight. James shook his hand. Thank you, Captain. All part of the job. But they both knew it wasn't just part of the job. It was part of life for people who looked like James. A reality that followed them regardless of their uniform, title, or credentials. As James walked through the jetway into the terminal, he noticed Patricia waiting just inside, standing awkwardly to the side as other passengers streamed past. She'd clearly rushed to beat him off the plane, possibly hoping to avoid another confrontation. When she saw him, she seemed to gather her courage and stepped forward. Agent Carter, she said, her voice much softer than it had been on the plane. I wanted to say that I'm sorry for my behavior earlier. James studied her face, trying to gauge her sincerity. Was she truly sorry for her prejudice, or just sorry she'd been caught and embarrassed? I overreacted, she continued when he didn't immediately respond. I didn't. You didn't expect someone who looks like me to be an FBI agent, James finished for her, or to be sitting in first class. Patricia flushed. That's not what I. It is what you meant, James said quietly. We both know it is. And here's the thing, Ms. Winters. If I hadn't been an FBI agent, your behavior would have been just as inappropriate. No one deserves to be treated with suspicion based solely on the color of their skin. She looked down at her expensive shoes. I'm not a racist, she whispered. I didn't say you were, James replied. But what you did was act on biased assumptions. And that hurts people. Real people with real lives and real feelings. Patricia glanced up, tears in her eyes. I really am sorry. I believe you, James said after a moment. And I hope this experience helps you think differently next time you find yourself making assumptions about someone. She nodded quickly, clearly eager to end the conversation. It will. I promise. As Patricia hurried away, Robert appeared at James's side. You're a better man than me, he said. I wouldn't have been so kind. James watched Patricia's retreating figure. It's not about being kind. It's about trying to create change. Anger rarely changes hearts and minds. They walked together toward baggage claim, discussing their time in law enforcement and sharing stories about the challenges they'd faced. By the time they reached the exit, they'd exchanged phone numbers and made plans to meet for dinner later in the week. Outside, James hailed a taxi and gave the driver his hotel address. As the cab pulled away from the curb, he leaned back against the seat and closed his eyes briefly. The confrontation on the plane had left him more drained than he wanted to admit. His phone buzzed with a text from Tanya. Just saw a video online of a Karen on a plane being put in her place by an FBI agent. Please tell me that wasn't you. James laughed out loud, startling the taxi driver who glanced at him in the rearview mirror. He quickly typed back, "It was me. Story of my life. I'll call you from the hotel." Looking out at the Chicago skyline growing closer, James thought about the training session tomorrow. He'd tell this story, not to shame Patricia or to paint himself as a hero, but to help those young recruits understand the reality many people faced every day. To help them see that justice wasn't just about enforcing laws, but about recognizing the humanity in everyone they encountered. The taxi driver, noticing James's FBI windbreaker, struck up a conversation. "You with the FBI, sir?" "Yes," James replied simply. "That's cool," the driver said with genuine admiration. "Must be an important job." "It is," James agreed. "But today, the most important part of my job had nothing to do with a badge or a title. It was about dignity, about standing firm in the face of prejudice without surrendering to anger, about showing that man in first class what an FBI agent looks like, not just for Patricia's benefit, but for everyone who witnessed it, for that young boy who might now grow up believing he too could wear that badge someday, for everyone who had ever been told, directly or indirectly, that they didn't belong."